$146 billion. That's how much the World Bank says Turkey could save if it takes effective and appropriate action to tackle climate change. Most of the benefits would come from reductions in energy imports and reduced pollution. Last year, Turkey imported 61 billion cubic meters of natural gas and nearly 3 million tons of oil. Turkey has committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2053. But to hit that goal, the World Bank says the country must decarbonize its power sector and move away from fossil fuels when it comes to transport. The reports add that the clearest path for Turkey to reach both energy security and to reduce emissions is to accelerate its domestic solar and wind power sectors. Over the last decade, Turkey has tripled its renewable energy capacity and is looking to invest further in battery technologies, geothermal energy, and carbon capture. The World Bank warned that due to the conflict in Ukraine, many countries, including Turkey, are at risk to energy price shocks. And for more on the World Bank report, I'm joined by its author, Stefan Hallegate. He is a senior climate change advisor at the World Bank. Stefan, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. The World Bank report says that Turkey stands to gain $146 billion over the next 20 years if it takes effective and appropriate actions against the climate change. How did the World Bank come up with this conclusion, and what does it mean for Turkey?
Well, we've been looking at two dimensions, right? The first one is how Turkey can better manage and reduce the risks that climate change poses for the country. And I mean, you all have seen those risks in the recent years with unprecedented floods and wildfires, water scarcity that affects agriculture. So the report is really looking at all of those actions that the country could implement to reduce those risks and reduce those losses. So part of those $146 billion are from this reduced impact. The other dimension is emission reductions, different energy used in the country, higher energy efficiency. And here we've looked at different sectors, the power sector, buildings, transportation, forestry, and look at how to combine emission reductions with economic growth, reduced poverty, better income for people, better quality of life.
Are there any countries in your report that stand to gain that amount of money over the next 20 years if they appropriately implement these criteria against the climate change?
So what we find is that really, like, all countries are different. Mm-hmm. All countries have different strengths and weaknesses. Turkey, for instance, has a lot of advantages with a very high share of renewable energy already in the power sector, a fairly sophisticated private sector with companies and firms able to mobilize the latest technologies. So it's no surprise that Turkey has all of this potential. And I have to say, all of the countries that are importing their oil and gas are countries that tend to benefit a lot from climate action, because in the country, there is about $100 billion that can be saved before 2040 just in reduced imports of oil and gas.
But it seems at the moment impossible. So what should Turkey do to achieve this target, and where does it stand in terms of climate regulations?
So first, Turkey has very ambitious climate goals. The objective of achieving net zero emissions in 2053 is ambitious. It's credible and feasible, but very ambitious. And Turkey is really doing part of its job at the global level to contribute to fixing the climate change challenge. So that's the first thing, because the country has been moving extremely fast and acting very strongly, especially in the last 12 months. The country can achieve this, but it doesn't mean it's easy. And the report is making some very strong recommendations on things that needs to happen. The first one I want to talk about maybe is the shift in energy policy. To achieve this objective of net zero emission in 2053, the country needs to scale up renewable energy quite a lot, but also make sure to keep the stability of the system, to have electricity storage, battery storage, pump hydro, and this is a significant program of work for the country. And in parallel, it needs to prepare for the exit from coal, which means that the country doesn't need more coal power plants. We show that it would make everything more expensive and electricity more expensive to build more coal power plants. but the country should also prepare to make sure this transition out of coal is not done at the expense of the people and the communities that depend on coal today. So for a just transition, action needs to start to prepare those communities, invest in those communities, help people retrain and reskill so that they can find jobs in different sectors. This cannot happen too fast because we need this transition to protect, especially the poorest and most vulnerable.
So how has the intensification of climate-related events like in recent years, including floods, forest fires, which are currently raging in the south of Turkiye, and sea pollution, exposed the urgency of this climate change action in the country, and how is it dealing with it now?
Yeah, so there used to be this story that climate change was about acting now to avoid impacts far in the future. And I think we're in a different world today where we see impacts of climate change already affecting people, affecting productivity, affecting quality of life. And Turkey has been at the forefront with the event that you mentioned. And those issues are connected. To achieve net zero emissions, the country will rely on its forests that can capture carbon from the atmosphere. And of course, forest fires is a threat to the role of forest in mitigation. So there are urgent actions to do in there. There are actions which are at the sectoral level. So the transport system, for instance, for an efficient economy, logistics is critical. So the transport system needs to be able to deal with climate shocks and climate risks. And we make suggestions about how to do that.
But how is that going to happen amidst the conflict in Ukraine? And do you believe that the Ukraine conflict has affected both Turkey and the European Union to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and 2053?
So, I mean, this crisis is creating a lot of uncertainty. But what's really important is to keep the long-term goal in view. So, yes, all countries will need to adjust to the impact on the price of gas and fertilizers especially, but it doesn't mean that the long-term goal needs to be different. I have to say that the strategy that we discussed in the report to achieve net zero emission in Turkey doesn't rely on more gas, quite the opposite. So in this context of very high prices, decarbonization and a scaling up of renewable energy, better energy efficiency in buildings and industries. There are a lot of synergies reducing the exposure and dependency of the country to imported gas and also increasing competitiveness, ability to export and economic growth. So it doesn't change the recommendation, but of course the uncertainty makes things more difficult.
But isn't the latest gas agreement between the European Union, Egypt and Israel is against this goal? I mean, can we say Europe is stuck in between its urgent need for fossil fuels to meet consumer demand and its ambitions for clean energy?
Yeah, that's where it's really important to make sure what we decide in the current urgency doesn't affect our long-term objectives and our ability to get there. So Europe is increasing those gas deals at the moment, but at the same time, it's really important that they also reduce demand and consumption of gas, for instance, by switching to electricity much more rapidly. If those two legs are there, we're good. The long-term goal will not change. And I think that's really what all countries have to do now to balance these short-term disruptions that are important and needs to be taken care of, while keeping in mind that we have a long-term objective that should not be jeopardized by this crisis.
But how countries focus more on mobilizing capital for climate action despite the potential risks and budgetary concerns?
So in our report, we show very much the importance the private sector will play in this transition. About half of the investments that are needed to achieve this transition are expected to come from the private sector. But that won't happen by itself. It needs the right policies, so the right incentives for the private sector, the right macroeconomic contexts with macroeconomic stability, of course, playing a key role. Increasing investments from abroad can also help countries manage those investment needs. So we're well aware that all countries have very strong constraints on public finance, and this is why the private sector will play a key role. But I want to end on that. The public sector will still have a big role to play in the regulations and also to help the poorest and most vulnerable. because the communities that are most exposed to risks, for instance, will need some support from the government and public resources to make sure they can adapt.
All right, Stefan, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.
Thank you for having me.